Good morning. So my wife Alejandra and I were missionaries in Colombia. I was a missionary kid that was actually born in Colombia. And as of about 7 years ago, I've been serving full time. These are some of the important people, James Rodriguez and Ivan Duque, the president and soccer player. And so we've been getting to serve in this beautiful country that has a lot of interesting colonial architecture and a lot of delicious fruits, and it borders Venezuela, and that's become one of the main ministries that Alejandra and I have been involved in recently in working with the immigrants. Venezuela, being a country of about 50 million people, has had more than 6 million immigrate outside of their country, and the majority of those immigrants will be coming into Colombia. Right where you see that little heart, that's Cucuta, which is the main border city, which is where Alejandra and I are living currently and are starting a church there, primarily with these Venezuelan immigrants. This right here is the actual border between the two nations. It's bridge there. Alejandra, she is standing on the Colombian side in that picture, and I'm standing on the Venezuelan side, while the people coming into Colombia and the people going into Venezuela would be coming right past me. And that is usually how people cross, but ever since the pandemic, that bridge has been closed. And so that hasn't stopped the amount of people that have been crossing. They just have to do it underneath the bridge now. And so this is what it usually would look like. It's just a little creek there that divides the two nations, and the desperation that people find themselves in with their whole economy collapsed and the government just being so corrupt is what forces them to find other opportunities elsewhere. In the midst of that, they're very sensitive to the gospel, and Alejandra, she's been wonderful and just making friends. And this is what it usually looks like for me when I'm starting out a Bible study. In this particular case, I was inside of a house with about 20 immigrants, and so we just started a Bible study and we started bringing food, and there was a pretty decent group that just sprung up into life within a very short amount of time. And then unfortunately, like is often the case, these immigrants, they're so transient that they would then just go on to other cities. And we have a very short amount of time to disciple and share the gospel. And we just hope that wherever they go, they can still find other contacts to continue growing in their knowledge and love of Jesus. Alejandra, she's helped a lot with just hospitality and working with some of these Venezuelan immigrants and befriending them. This was like a refugee camp where I met a Venezuelan evangelist, and so we kind of teamed up, and the fellow that was holding the flag there, he was one of the men that we discipled and we got to baptize, and he had a pretty rough past, but it was amazing to see that transformation in him. You can see Venezuelan immigrants just on the side of the street. And in many cases, Alejandra has been able to help out with some of the children and take care of them while their parents are scrambling around. In this case, their mother was about to have a child, and so she was in the hospital, and Alejandra was able to take care of the other children. This was a cool ministry that I was able to start and be a part of. In a barber shop. For some reason, Venezuelan immigrants are really good barbers, and so they would be working on a Sunday morning, and so on Saturday mornings before they would open up, we would do a Bible study, and one of the barbers, he was a believer, so it was fun to partner with him and to be able to share the gospel to this group of people who would normally not be walking into a church building. This is in another town that Alejandra and I were working in. where we were able to start a church and start renting this building, which was a very big blessing. And we had a lot of young people, and that's usually what we're shooting towards, is to actually have a more elaborate service where we're, taking part in the Lord's Supper and having more of a formal setting. We got married, and that was a blast. And now I'm learning a lot in the process. These are just some different pictures of Alejandra and I in the different cities that we've served in Bogota. On top of that roof, we actually had some open air meetings during the pandemic, and some of our Venezuelan immigrant friends who didn't have very good internet connectivity, we still sensed a desire to share the gospel with them, and so we would meet on top of that roof and continue to study the Bible. And so they weren't able to meet in Zoom, and we were a little bit audacious in doing this at the time, but it seemed to have worked, at least temporarily. And this other town, which is where we had served then for about 5 months after we got married, and then this last one with my Venezuelan jacket is right in Cucuta, the location that I was talking to you about previously. This is another member of our family, a car, a blue SUV that is actually Russian, and it's good at carrying potatoes, but even more than that, it's been a big blessing in carrying Venezuelan immigrants. And this is just a picture that I took of a family that was walking along the road many times for about 2 weeks. They would be walking just to get to Bogota. And so whenever we're driving along the highway and we see some Venezuelan immigrants, we'll stop and pick them up and maybe talk to them on the side of the road, and maybe give them some food and encourage them. In this picture, we saw these 2 kids that were just playing while their parents were sleeping. And we're like, man, this is insane. Like, it's kind of dangerous. We woke up our Venezuelan friends, and we offered them to travel in the vehicle with us. And in some cases, we see larger groups, and so I'll like drive a ways up until a toll booth, and then I'll right before the toll booth, I'll come around and pick the rest of them up, and then bring them up to the toll booth, and then cross, and then pick up the other group, and then come back around and then pick that group up too. And it's amazing, because what would otherwise take them like 2 days to travel, we can do it in about 2 hours. And within a car, there's a lot of opportunity to talk and to just get to know each other and to share the gospel. So sometimes they're just exhausted and they end up sleeping. But that too just shows how difficult it must be, like, as you're doing this day by day. And so in this case, it was pretty neat, because we were driving back to church and we picked up these Venezuelan immigrants, and that was on Good Friday during Holy Week. And so we were going to have a special service where we were going to like even wash each other's feet. And so we were especially excited to do that to these Venezuelan immigrants, because if there was anyone that needed their feet washed and just like to have a massage and just to rest from having been on their feet for so long, it would have been them. And so we also gave them some food, and then the church collected an offering where we could pay for a hotel, and then give them enough money so that they could take a bus the rest of the way. And I felt like that's important, where it's not just Alejandra and I helping out our friends, but we're getting the whole church involved, where they too feel that they can be a part of this. So these are just some more pictures of different friends, and these are some Venezuelan soldiers that I met when I was traveling inside of Venezuela once. And even though they're under orders of the authoritarian dictator Nicolas Maduro, and even though I'm against his government, I still recognize that everyone needs to hear the gospel, indifferent of their political allegiance. And so it was a crazy trip when I was inside of Venezuela on that particular occasion. I've been in there like probably about 9 times, and Alejandra and I haven't been able to travel as much since they've closed the border, but this was just a rare opportunity where once we got to our destination, I invited these Venezuelan soldiers out to eat, and we had like 2 hours where we were getting into some of the more deeper passages and implications of the gospel. I don't know, I hope that someday I will see them in heaven, and maybe the first person you imagine when you go to heaven wouldn't necessarily be a Venezuelan soldier, but they too, if they trust in Jesus, can find eternal life. And so these are also just some pictures of some Colombian soldiers that I was able to share the gospel to. And that's just a powerful image, isn't it, of how both nations who would be with a lot of tension one towards the other, in Christ, those barriers are broken, and hopefully both Colombian soldiers and Venezuelan soldiers can praise the Lord with one mind and one heart. This is a little tuk-tuk motorized tricycle that I bought, and so I've been lending it to this Venezuelan pastor who is living on the Colombian side of one of the border towns, and so he's been using that and giving a job to 2 other men to drive it around and create an income for themselves, and also send me a percentage of their profits, which really isn't too much. It would probably take me about more than 10 years to pay off that tuk-tuk, but it's a good way to practically and realistically help some of our friends that have just lost everything when they're in Venezuela. I mean, it's as if you had a $100 bill, and then 10 months later, that $100 bill isn't even worth a penny, and the paper itself is worth more than the monetary value on top of it. And this was just a family that Alejandra and I helped out. I had mentioned to you earlier that the mother, the wife, she was about to give birth to her 5th child, and so Alejandra and I picked them up from where they were and brought them to our apartment, and they were able to stay there while they had their 5th child, and then as they were recuperating before they went on their journey. We had already known them for some time, and they had traveled a lot further, and then they were coming back, and so that whole coordination took place shortly after we were married. So it's kind of like our honeymoon experience to host all of them. And then to have them stay in our apartment, and then the landlord be frustrated that we did that, and so them having her kick us out as well. But we felt like they needed it a lot more. And I mean, the option for them at the time was just staying on the ground and in the street. And you can imagine how crazy that would be with so many kids and with a wife that's pregnant. This is just another fellow that we met on the street while he was playing his instrument, and we became good friends with him. And then he came to know the Lord, and then he had been living with his partner, with whom they had a daughter. And so we encouraged them to get civilly married, and then we had a ceremony shortly before we came here to the States, which was awesome to be able to see that growth in this family. These are some more Venezuelan friends. These are actually a family that has been staying in our apartment in our absence while we're here in the States, and they're looking out for the group of friends that we have in Cucuta and continuing in pastoring and shepherding that group. This is just another friend that lives on the Venezuelan side of the border, and if the Lord permits, Alejandra and I would like to live in the house right next door to them. The wife, she makes little action figures and little candles that then her husband sells on the other side of the border. And we also bought them an inverter so that their electricity wouldn't go out, and they could have a constant light in their house. And these action figures, the wife, she had made a replica of this picture that we took in our engagement, which is just shows you how amazing she is at being able to do this kind of thing. It's a creative way for them to have a life. And this is the house they live in, and that one right next door to it is vacant. So I've been telling my friend, hey, if you ever see that the border's about to open or something, maybe Alejandra and I could live right next to you guys inside of Venezuela. So that's kind of what we're hoping for. And thank you very much for just letting me give you that quick overview, and then we'll get into the message here shortly. And there was another team member. He was the team captain, and he was a spectacular athlete that he would always try to compete with me to see who could finish first with about 3 miles that we would run before practice every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And so I remember there was one time where this particular occasion, we were super close. We were super neck to neck, and we had already run like 4 of the laps, and there was just one more that we needed to do. And so on that last lap, we just started booking it and like running our hearts out, and we were both like super close to one another. And right on the last loop, as we were coming back to the finish line, this was a dirt road, my friend's legs got away from him, and he just bit. He like wiped out big time, got full of dust and blood, and it was such a like intense moment that I just like stopped, and I like started screaming at him. I was like, get up, Luke, get up. And like, I'm not gonna let you finish like this. And so he got up, and then we kind of like put our arms around each other, and then we ran to the finish line. But that was sort of like an introduction for me into running. And then when I was in college, I definitely wasn't good enough to play for the basketball team, so I just started running for fun. And my roommate, he decided to run a marathon, and so he asked me if I wanted to, and I was like, sure, I could try to train a little bit for that and see if I could run one of those. And I remember that the day I actually ran my first marathon, I pushed myself really hard, and I was able to keep up with one of the fastest woman runners of that race. And I just remember, like, at the very end of it, I was so exhausted and so overwhelmed. I finally crossed the finish line with my best ever race time for marathons. And like, I just started crying like crazy. And I just felt like in so much pain, but like I was so like happy to have finished it. And just like all the emotions that you feel while you were running, they were all like condensed in that one moment. Well, another story of when I was running once was for the first date that I had with Alejandra, which is kind of a weird place to take a girl on a date to. We really didn't know that we were on a date at the time. And I'd been driving her back to town, and I was going to run a race that night, so I invited her, and she was watching for me there at the finish line. And I think that as I ran that race, I think one of my main inspirations was to know that she was there watching me, and that I was going to be able to either impress her by being a top finisher, or I just wanted to run fast so I could get back and be with her again and hang out with her and see her. And so I mention all these stories because as we think about the Olympics, which we're in the middle of right now, we see a lot of these examples of people like disciplining themselves and dedicating themselves for years to try to be as good as they can at a particular sport, and how some of these principles of discipline and athleticism are also comparable to the spiritual life. And that last example that I gave you, there was a sense of wanting to get to the end so that I could have the reward of seeing my future wife, which I didn't know was going to be my future wife at the time. There's a young lady that I was intrigued by, and she was there waiting for me, and so I didn't want to disappoint her. In 1 Corinthians 9, it talks about this at the end of the chapter, and we'll start unpacking some of the initial verses of this chapter after I mentioned the last conclusion, which has to do with racing in particular. It says in verse 24, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Therefore, I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air, but I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified." So Paul here, he's using an illustration to teach the principle of everything he's been talking about previously. And he uses this concept of either running or boxing. And he says that he has purpose and he has intention and he has courage and discipline as he's running. The idea is that he's not just running aimlessly. He's not just out to have a good time. He's trying to win a prize. And to win a prize, you have to go into strict training. It also talks about boxing as though he's not just beating the air as if he's trying to show off and have fun, but as if he were actually like putting in all he could, not necessarily to knock out the opponent, but actually it says that he's beating himself. In the first example of a race, we see that he's competing against others, but then in the second illustration of a boxer, it says he's actually beating himself and putting his body under discipline so that he would not be disqualified and he would be able to succeed in this tremendous feat of strength. And it's almost as if he realizes his greatest enemy is himself. And that's why he has to subdue himself. And that's why he has to beat himself. And when his body is telling him, I want to stop, he keeps pushing it. And when his body is telling him, I want to eat a bunch of donuts, he says, no, I'm going to eat some salad and drink some water. And it's this concept of how he's so concerned about winning the prize and not being disqualified that he not only adjusts, but completely transforms his lifestyle so as to be a serious competitor in the race that's marked out for him. It says that those who compete in these types of prizes or in these types of races, they do it for a wreath that is perishable, but that we compete for a wreath or a prize that is imperishable. The allusion here is to the games that would take place in Corinth. They were similar to the Olympic Games, but these were like the second largest competitions that they would have at the time. And in the final awarding ceremony, all the winner would get is a wreath that they could put around their head and walk back home, and everybody could see that they were the winner. So it wasn't really like an important, valuable prize in and of itself. It was rather the symbolism of what that prize made people understand, is that this person was the best in whichever category they were competing. And we're watching the Olympics right now, and it's inspiring and it's fun, and you're just wanting to see people break records and show that within a matter of milliseconds, they can be the strongest or most agile or fastest person on the face of the planet. And we know that those few seconds that they have to show their worth has come with blood and sweat and tears and years of training and dedication and commitment to this specific cause. And that's what makes these races so inspiring in these competitions. And everyone is seeing these stories of how people are overcoming obstacles to be able to accomplish this. Just yesterday, there was a man from a fairly obscure country that won the gold medal in swimming. And no one thought that he was even going to be on the podium. He was probably ranked 8th in all the competitors. But that day, that moment of knowing that he was in the race, he just did far better than even what he anticipated. And that excitement and that joy of finally having been able to make it to the end of the pool and to realize that just by a few milliseconds, he had beat everyone else was amazing. You know, and these stories that we watch, they're just something that I'm sure somebody at some point was watching a similar competition and they're like, hey, I wonder if I could do that. And they were really young. And I was like, maybe if I start working towards this, I'll also be able to accomplish something great. And then they didn't. They went ahead and they did everything they could to make that possible. Now, in our walk with Christ and in our spiritual life, there is a definite sense in which we are fighting for a reward. We're trying to give it our best shot to be able to accomplish something important at the end of the day. And it's important to realize that what Paul is talking about here is not salvation. Paul was very emphatic and very clear in other passages in the whole Bible, for that matter, about how salvation is ultimately a gift of God that does not depend on our works or our efforts, but it's his grace that is given to us. And there's nothing that we could do to try to make up for that or try to impress God. And we have been talking about that in the Lord's Supper. And I think we understand this concept. But once we are saved, I do believe that there is theology of rewards, if we could call it that sometimes we overlook, that sometimes we just don't feel is very spiritual, or we don't feel is something that is too important in our lives. But I think Paul did understand this theology of rewards, and he did seriously care about it. He was more interested in coming to the presence of God and being saved by grace through Jesus Christ, but also being victorious in his pursuit of the call that God had given him and how he executed it throughout his life. It's as if you were a sailor and your ship got shipwrecked, and you're glad you make it to shore, you're glad you're alive, but you really don't have much to show for yourself. After that long voyage, you really don't have much to say about what you accomplished. But Paul, he wanted to be far more than that. He wanted to arrive before the throne of God and be able to say, God, you saved me, and I poured my life into helping others also be saved. I poured my life into following you and to trying to subdue the sin that was always creeping against my very flesh. And I was just trying to follow you as closely as possible. I was looking at you, Jesus, the whole time I ran this race. And I'm glad that I can be here and I can hear the words, welcome, my good and faithful servant. But that was something that he used as an inspiration in his life in the day-to-day efforts that he was facing. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, we know that this is what Paul is talking about, because there too, he also lays out this concept that in verse 10 of 1 Corinthians 3, it says, according to the grace of God which was given to me, like a wise master builder, I laid a foundation, and another is building on it. But each man must be careful how he builds on it. For no man can lay a foundation other than the one which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. And so right there it says that the foundation of any man's work, the foundation of any man's life is Jesus Christ. That's how it starts. Once we believe in him, then we have a relationship with God and we are saved, and then the rest of our lives are being built upon that. And then it says in verse 12, if any man builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each man's work will become evident, for the day will show it, because it is to be revealed with fire, and the fire itself will test the quality of each man's work. If any man's work which he has built on it remains, he will receive a reward. If any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire. So I think that's the main passage that talks about this concept of a reward that isn't a matter of salvation, as we said, because the fire itself is testing the work that one has done. And after the fire cleanses and does a judgment, as it were, of the way in which this person was building his or her life, then they will be saved. But if they did not build with precious stones or with golds, then it would probably be burnt up. A lot of the time and a lot of the activities in their life wouldn't have been of much value. But if we do invest our lives in things that are eternal, if we place our treasure on things above, and we invest in the kingdom of God and seek first his kingdom, these are the things that will endure, and these are the things that we will be able to present before God. And I really don't think it's so much a matter of presenting yourself to receive glory and honor for what you've done. Rather, the work that one has done is always for the glory of God, isn't it? And I even believe that perhaps once we're in heaven and these efforts of ours are revealed, then that will be like a continual way for us to demonstrate the glory to the Father through our lives here on earth. And it's a reward that will last, in stark contrast to the rewards of these wreaths that the athletes would receive in the time of Corinth, that, you know, as soon as you put it on your head and you walk to your house, I mean, pretty soon that pine is going to wither and lose its color and become dry and just become a bunch of dust, you know. But what we invest in the kingdom of heaven does not rust, and moths do not consume it, and thieves do not break in and take it away. But it's something that is internal. And Paul's encouragement to us all is to invest in this way and to invest in these things, because they're the things that matter. We are saved by grace, but it's not like we're just going to stop living our lives with intention and just enjoy the ride from there on out, but rather we make an effort to really please God in everything we do, not because he would be somehow against us if we didn't do that. We're already saved, and God already sees us through Jesus Christ, and we've already received that righteousness. But that gratitude that we have for which we have received is what then compels us and motivates us to continue on in this journey. And in fact, this concept of being compelled, or this concept of being obligated, Paul, he brings that out in this passage. And in 1 Corinthians 9, what Paul is really doing is kind of defending his own ministry. and he's like, look, you guys in Corinth don't think I'm really special, right? I mean, you have other speakers that have come that are really eloquent, that are super apostles, as it were, and seem to be able to get everybody fascinated with the way in which they do ministry. And you guys have started to disregard me, even though I was the very one that planted the seed to make this church start to grow. And so Paul, he's kind of defending his ministry and what he's done. And he's like, look, we've worked hard for your sake, and you yourselves are our evidence of this work. And in the process of us working for your benefits, there's a few demonstrations of how we've gone beyond the limit of normal expectations in ministry. And what are those two examples? One is that Paul was single, and Paul, he understood that in his singleness, there was a lot that he could do for the sake of the gospel. And even though he had the right to get married, just like Peter had been, and just like other apostles had also been married, Paul was like, no, I'm not gonna enjoy that privilege. Rather, I'm going to remain single, because that way I will not have my interests divided, and I'll be able to dedicate myself completely to the work of sharing the gospel and of building up churches and have it all for the glory of God. And his second example is that of money. And so Paul starts to talk about how it's completely legitimate that anyone who would be preaching would receive money to be able to sustain him or herself within that ministry. And that not only is it a right, but it's also good that churches have this culture of giving to those who work hard among them. But you know what Paul says? He says, even though I have both of these rights, even in the scriptures, oxen, they had the right to eat from the food as they were working in the fields, I have refrained myself from doing it so because I want to prove to you all the genuine and authentic nature of my ministry. It isn't something that I'm doing for profitable gain. It isn't something that I'm doing just because I want to be able to live a comfortable lifestyle. He's saying my proof of my authenticity is that I am not receiving from the church in Corinth any offerings that they may give, just so that I can have this boast that I am serving the Lord for free. It's because I love him, and it's because I'm compelled, I'm constrained. In fact, it says that. He says, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. In verse 16, it says, I have used none of these things, and I am not writing these things so that it will be done so in my case. Isn't that interesting? Sometimes that's an issue that I as a missionary can battle. You know, like when I'm writing my updates or when I come here to a church and I'm giving a report of what I've been doing, it's like in the back of my mind, I could have this weird intention of doing so to impress you guys, so that hopefully then you guys would be extra generous with me and be like, he's doing an awesome job, let's give him a bunch of money so that he can keep serving in Colombia. But Paul says that was not his intention. It definitely was not. Rather, says he would rather die than have a boast, like to not be able to have this boast. He's like, I'm doing all these things for the sake of the gospel. And as he preaches the gospel, he says, I have nothing to boast of in verse 16, for I am under compulsion. For woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this voluntarily, I have a reward. But if against my will, I have a stewardship entrusted to me. So he's talking about how if you just have a job that you have to fulfill, and that's your only mentality when you wake up and you go and you're working at a tire shop and you're sweating and you're interacting with people that are complicated, but you're thinking all along that I'm going to get a paycheck at the end of the week. And so that's why I'm putting up with this. Like, he has a reward because that would be the normal attitude to have within any work context. But could you imagine a guy that works in a tire shop that wakes up in the morning and says, I'm not going to get paid anything for doing this, and I'm going to go and do it because I love changing tires that much, and I love getting dirty, and I love the heat, and I love the stress of the environment. And so he just gets after it every single morning. You'd be like, this guy's crazy. What is he doing? Well, that's what Paul is saying. He's like, I'm not doing this for the sake of the reward here that I can get among people. Like, are you kidding me? That's almost like a slap in the face, because my reward is in heaven, and I long to be in the presence of my Savior so much that all of this other stuff pales by comparison. And so like physical money, that to me is of no interest. Rather, I'm continuing to pour out my life because I have this reward since I'm doing it voluntarily. And that's the reward that he's thinking of eternally, not a monetary reward that he could be receiving here on the earth. So he says that he is not making full use of his rights in the gospel. And then he says, though I am free, and this is a fascinating passage, and I love it because I'm a missionary, and so I really have to preach to myself here as I'm preaching to all of you guys, okay? In verse 19, let's read this. It says, for though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I may win more. To the Jews, I became as a Jew, so that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, so that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might win those who are without law. To the weak, I became weak, that I might win the weak. I become all things to all men, so that I may by all means save some. I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it. Here we see Paul's intention to become relevant, okay? And that word relevant sometimes can turn people off, because within churches we say, oh, well, we need to be more relevant to society. And we're like, no, how could we do that? Because society is so corrupt and so sinful. If we're being relevant, it's like we're kind of giving a nod to culture, which is corrupted. But that's not Paul's attitude. Why is that? Well, let me tell you why. It's because the very definition of gospel itself is relevancy. Why do I say that? Because the gospel is God becoming relevant to mankind. God, in his eternal state of power and magnificence and glory, he clothed himself in humanity so that he could become relevant to us. God became relevant to us by becoming man and interacting with us and talking with us and teaching us and healing people who are sick and inviting the marginalized and the outcast to know that they were loved and cherished. And as Paul understood how relevant the gospel was to his own life, then in seeing the rest of the world and knowing the commission that God had given him to make disciples, he wanted to be as effective in that as possible. It's kind of like this. Imagine that we were going to be running in this year's Olympics. In 2021, instead of being here in Charlotte, North Carolina, we're out in Tokyo, and we're all going to compete in a race. And some of you guys say, hey, I know of some cool runners like Eric Little back in the day that ran with some shoes that are a lot different than the type of Nike shoes with air and really great suspension that people wear today. And since I really like Eric Liddell, and since I really like his story of how the Lord used him despite all odds, I think I'm going to run my race here in Tokyo with the same type of shoes that he ran with back in the 30s. Could you imagine how ridiculous that would be? Like, are you kidding me? You have such an amazing technology of new shoes that you could be using and which would help you significantly, but you're going to be stubborn and just run the race with something that's a little more antiquated. Well, that's your right to do that. And if you enjoy it, then that's great. But if you're really competing and if you're really trying to win this thing, then you would probably want to use everything that's at your disposal to do the best performance that you possibly can. And again, this has nothing to do with salvation, but this has everything to do with being effective and being relevant and reaching more people, becoming all things to all men, so that by all means you may save some. You do this for the sake of the gospel, that you may become a fellow partaker of it. The gospel is something that we receive and we enjoy and we relish and cherish everything that God has given us. But we can't be envious or just so reluctant to share that with others that we're not willing to stoop down and get a little dirty and get a little uncomfortable even in the way that God would have us reach out to those who are different than we are. That's the whole essence of this passage. It says that Paul was willing to adapt. He says, I'm a Jew, yeah, okay, but I'm going to become as a Jew so that I might win Jews to those who are under the law. Now, as under the law, though I myself not being under it, so that I might win those who are under the law. So here he's talking about one population of the Jews that would adhere to all the Old Testament practices of traditions and rituals and things that Paul in many cases has communicated as being ineffective for salvation. He is still willing to follow along with some of these practices so as to not offend the Jews as he's ministering to them. So one example, for instance, would be when he takes Timothy and he circumcises him because he doesn't want people to be having an extra reason to be against them in their missionary journey. But he's like, okay, we're going to try to reach the Jews, and so let's just like take away as many barriers as possible so that the main thing that we want to present to them, the gospel, is truly the thing that they're grappling with, not other things. And that's even why, for instance, when Paul went to Jerusalem, it says that he made a Nazirite vow before going inside of the temple, because that too was a way in which people would accept them. That kind of backfired on him, and then he ended up in prison. But these were specific instances in which he was willing to change a little bit of his style, even though he knew full well that these practices had nothing to do with salvation. He was still willing to embrace them for the sake of others. You get what I mean? And that's a revolutionary concept. It really is. That we should do this kind of thing. And for instance, Paul, in some cases, would be like, well, if you think that this has anything to do with salvation, then I'm definitely not going to do it, because I don't want to confuse what that very definition is. But in that initial stage of just being someone who would be welcomed by others, he's willing to put up with idiosyncrasies that others have so as to win them over. And it talks then about those who are without the law, as though he was without the law of God, which is talking about like the Old Testament, but yet he's still under the law of Christ. And that's a key to unlocking all of what Paul is saying. There's a new law that we have under Christ, and there's a new reality of discipline. There's a new reality of giving everything we have to serve him and to love him and to follow him. But that reality is different than the Old Testament practices of don't handle, don't touch, don't get close to this, do that. All these things, Jesus, he transforms them in many ways. And so even in the life of Jesus, we see how sometimes he was a little bit audacious in healing people on the Sabbath and in like eating food that his disciples are like gleaning on the Sabbath as well. And it's kind of defiant for the culture in which people thought that by doing these things, they were being saved. And Jesus, like Paul, he realizes that he is not under this law, and rather he is under, well, especially Paul, definitely Paul, he's under the law that Christ had given him. And so these other things he was willing to change with. So even though Paul, he came from a Jewish background, he's like, I'm not going to remain acting like a Jew everywhere I go, but when I go and serve in Cyprus, or when I go out to Greece, or when I'm even hoping to get to Rome someday, I'm going to adapt, I'm going to change. And we see that in the book of Acts, how sometimes he's speaking in Greek, and other times he's speaking in Aramaic, and sometimes he pulls out that card and he's like, don't you know that I'm a Roman citizen? And other times he's saying, if there was any person to be able to boast in his credentials, that would be me, because I was born an Israelite, and I'm an Israelite of Israelites, and I'm a Hebrew from the lineage of Benjamin, and I have an impeccable record of all the things that I've been able to follow within these Jewish traditions. But what does he say? All this is rubbish. All of this is garbage compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing Christ. And he's giving his all because of this wonderful thing that he has in him. And the cultural aspects of his life, he's able to adapt one way or the other. This is an important point right here. The gospel itself is never to be tampered with. The message that we communicate to others never changes. We are saved entirely by grace through faith, and this not of ourselves, it is a gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. It is exclusively in Jesus Christ. And the only authority in our lives is the scriptures. Okay, these are fundamental principles that we will never tamper with. But the way in which we present these things can change at different times. In fact, he also mentions in here the weak. And just before in chapter 8, Paul is talking about how there's this concept of food sacrificed to idols. And some people, they have a clear conscience when they're eating this food sacrificed to idols. They know that idols don't mean anything, that they believe in the one true God. And so as they're eating meat, they're just enjoying something that God gave them to be able to enjoy. But others who are coming from a background where they see meat as being a hindrance to their relationship with God, they don't understand how that is something that you can so easily write off. Why? Because they're brand new believers. In chapter 8, they are, at least. They're brand new believers who are still like, whoa, I have a lot of new things that I'm grappling with about how I'm supposed to live a godly life. And I know that when I eat meat sacrificed to idols, when I was living in my former reality as being a sinner separated from God, that was an act of devotion to a pagan deity that I was once worshiping. And so how could I ever do that if I'm like a new creature in Christ? And another person who has been a believer for some time and realizes that
that's all nonsense anyway, is completely fine with eating the meat. But Paul's point is that, hey, be careful. Like, don't exert your rights at all times because there's something bigger at play. That's exactly what he's saying in chapter 9. He has the right to get married. He has the right to receive money for his ministry, but he refuses those rights so as to be more effective in the gospel. So also with his other brothers, if someone has a problem with this and they have a weak conscience, then we're going to be careful and we're not going to get into it. What's the problem though sometimes with this type of thinking is that many times in churches, I believe, we're catering not necessarily to people who are weak in their faith, people that are actually very strong in their faith and that aren't going to falter on their belief in God according to what they see other people doing or not. But they're just things that they like, traditions that they enjoy. And so we're catering to them instead of really understanding the desperate need we have to be sensitive to those who are new in the faith. And again, there's a clear line and a clear boundary between that which is something that isn't essential for the truth of the gospel and something that is a good recommendation not to do so as to make someone else stumble. And I think the most typical example of this is alcohol, right? That if there's a new believer that has a temptation to drink alcohol, then if you're a believer and you're hanging around this other person, like you wouldn't want to like get into that. Why would you be a cause of temptation to your brother? But if someone ever came and told you, hey, if you drink alcohol, you are not saved, you know what I would do right then? I would go get a can of beer and I would drink it right in front of them. I'd be like, I am saved. I'm saved entirely by the work of Jesus Christ on the cross. You cannot mess with that, okay? It's important. It's important that you guys realize these things because, man, like people can get so confused sometimes and it's just insane. Like, you have to understand the true definition of the gospel. And I really think that in 1 Corinthians 9, when Paul's talking about the weak, he's probably referring to Gentiles who are somehow attracted to Judaism, and they still weren't believers necessarily, but they were people who were sympathizing with Jewish customs. And Paul is realizing that there's multiple groups of populations that he's trying to reach. One, the Jews. Two, the Gentiles. And three, the Gentiles who are starting to adhere to Jewish customs. And so he's making himself, one, relevant to Jews, two, relevant to Gentiles, and three, relevant to people who are Gentiles but are adhering to Jewish customs. And they all need to know about the ultimate law of Christ. They know about the law of God, but it's the law of Christ that we're truly under. And that's what we really have to communicate. And that's what we really have to get after. In this concept of rewards, there is a parable that's really neat in Luke chapter 17 that I would like to mention. In verse 7, it says, which of you, having a slave plowing or tending sheep, will say to him when he is coming from the field, come immediately and sit down to eat? But will he not say to him, prepare something for me to eat, and properly clothe yourself, and serve me while I eat and drink, and afterward you may eat and drink? He does not thank the slave because he did the things which were commanded, does he? So you too, when you do all the things which are commanded, you say, we are unworthy servants. We have done only that which we ought to have done. And I feel like that's my reality as a missionary, as a Christian. Like, I feel better than anyone. I mean, Jesus, he told me to go and make disciples. Is that anything extra than the fact that I'm doing that? Is that anything extra than what God has already told me to do? No, it isn't. It's exactly what he told me to do. And if I fulfill my job, that doesn't make me a good servant. It just makes me a servant that does what he's told he's supposed to do. And that's all of us. All of us have been called to do this. And that's why it doesn't make me any better than anyone else. In fact, I probably am less impressive than other people. Why? Because I do receive monetarily for this work of preaching the gospel. And I am married. and there's people out there that serve without being compensated monetarily for it. There's people that do it without that freedom that they would have to also be married. And Paul uses this word freedom. And freedom is something that we have to fight for. We all know that because we're Americans. And we fight for the free and we're brave. And yet, Paul's like, hey, I'm going to make myself under the law if that's going to win people. But for those, in other cases, I am going to like live in my freedom and fight for that too. You know, I mean, there's just not a cookie cutter like method, in my opinion, for how we go about reaching other people because we're adapting it. Like Jesus himself, he said, go and make fishers of men. When we're fishing for fish, we're clever enough to realize that by just throwing a hook in the water, it isn't very likely that we're going to get very much. And so we have lures and we have different methods to try to attract fish. And some of the fishers that started following Jesus, they at times were super ineffective. And then Jesus comes along and tells them, hey, throw the net on the right-hand side of the boat. The right-hand side, you always throw on the left-hand side. So they're doing something a little awkward, a little uncomfortable. And then all of a sudden it's this amazing catch. And so they're close to Jesus. They're listening to Jesus, what he's telling you throughout the process. And you're just using your common sense too. Like, how can I really be more effective in doing this? I'm working with Colombians. I'm working with Venezuelans. If I go into Venezuela and I act like, oh, Colombia has the best soccer team, and oh, I just love the Colombian food, and I use all the slang that we use in Colombia, yeah, it may be cute for a little while, but if I'm really going to live there and I'm really going to try to reach Venezuelans, I got to be like, I care more about the Venezuelan soccer team than I do about the Colombian soccer team. And you think, oh, you're such a traitor for doing that. Fine, I don't care if I'm a traitor. I'm trying to reach people for Christ, you know? And it's that sense of adapting. And what's fascinating to me is that as I'm here in the States and I talk about the ministry, I think so many people understand that when they consider missions. There's like, oh yeah, that's common sense. But for some reason in the States, it's often difficult to get that mentality because we're used to doing things that we've done for 50 years and we don't necessarily want to change. Why should we? Well, maybe because there would be others who would be able to enter in and see your friendship and see your effort and be drawn to Christ, which is really the only thing we want them to be drawn to. We don't want them to be drawn to all this peripheral stuff around it. But if we can break those barriers down, just so that they have to come to the stone that the builders rejected, and that some have fallen and hit their face on the ground with, but yet others have realized that it's the very capstone, very cornerstone on which their whole life will be built. That's what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 3, is that this is the foundation that everyone has to build on. And after that, go ahead, build with different materials, but be careful with what you're doing, because at the end of the day, your work will be revealed one way or another. I just want to mention one more passage in 2 Peter chapter 1, and with that we'll finish. It says this in 2 Peter. And in verse 3 to 11, it says, seeing that his divine power has granted to us everything pertaining to life and godliness, through the true knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and excellence. For by these he has granted to us his precious and magnificent promises, so that by them we may become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world by lust. Now for this very reason also, applying all diligence in your faith, supply moral excellence, and in your moral excellence, knowledge, and in your knowledge, self-control, and in your self-control, perseverance, and in your perseverance, godliness, and in your godliness, brotherly kindness, and in your brotherly kindness, love. So what is the order here? It says that we're saved, okay? We have this reality that we are escaped by the corruption that is in this world, and now we apply all diligence to add to our faith. We're already saved by faith, but now we have all these other things that we can add to it. Moral excellence, knowledge, self-control, perseverance. Man, all those things are so crucial for us in our lives. But I love it how it ends. It's like, and brotherly kindness. You want to do things because you love your brothers. It's not because of yourself. It's not because of how important you think you are. It's because you realize that there's so much that this other person needs from me, and I'm doing it all in love. In 1 Corinthians 13, it talks about what an amazing missionary someone would be if they gave all their possessions to the poor, if they sacrificed their life to the flame. But if they had not love, they sound like nothing, they accomplish nothing, and they are nothing. Love is so elemental and important in everything that we do, and we need to grow in love and continually get better at it. Because if we increase in these qualities, it will keep us from being useless or unfruitful. Man, if I'm a competitor and I'm thinking, how can I win this race and not be useless? You know, what I've got to do? Well, that was the list right there. Add to your faith all these things, and then you may do well in this race that's marked out for you. It says, be all the more diligent to make certain about his calling and choosing you, for as long as you practice these things, you will never stumble. For in this way, the entrance into the eternal kingdom of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ will be abundantly supplied to you. It's this image of walking in to the gates of splendor of heaven and realizing that you've poured your heart out, just like it was for me in that first marathon, man. I gave it my best, and my body was depleted. I was exhausted. I was weak, but I crossed that finish line. And as I beheld what I had just accomplished, like my emotions just were overwhelming. And I believe that that's what it will be like in the presence of God. It will be like anything that I sacrificed here on earth, that was nothing compared to this amazing experience to be face to face with my God. And you enter in there, like not as someone that was shipwrecked, that just barely made it to shore, not as someone that just barely passed through the flames, but as someone that stands with confidence, knowing that they fought for things that really mattered, you know? So that said, let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you that you have gone before us, and we're not running a brand new race. We're not trying to figure this out as we go, but we're just keeping our eyes on you. And we know that you're the author and you're the perfecter of our faith, and help us to keep our eyes on you. Help us to be disciplined. Help us to love others, and help us to be relevant and adapt and be sensitive to the needs of those around us. Thank you that Jesus modeled this so perfectly, and he would stand up to those who were tampering with the truth, and yet he would be sensitive and loving to those who were just overwhelmed in their sin, and they knew that they needed help, and Jesus was right there to give them that lending hand. Let us have this mind of Christ also, and help us to not run aimlessly, help us to not box when beating the air, but make our bodies and our lives slaves so that after we preach to others, we ourselves